Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, I chat with Andrea Torres Villanueva, an associate director on KBRA's funds team. Andrea and I discuss the issues and risks surrounding governance controls in the fund space from the perspective of a credit rating analyst. We highlight a notable example of what can happen when a fund does not have appropriate operational management in place to control for these risks, as well as the due diligence that KBRA employs through our credit rating process to mitigate and safeguard against these risks. Thanks for joining me today, Andrea. To start off, I think it would be helpful for you to give us a high-level overview of the governance topics that are highly relevant for a fund manager for those who might not be as familiar with the sector.
Hi, Arianne, and thanks for having me. So for a fund manager, there are several layers of governance considerations. First and foremost, it is important for us to understand the organizational structure and key control provisions of an asset manager. So from a ratings perspective, it is important that a fund manager has the appropriate controls in place that provide for checks and balances to investment decision-making, cash management, and other key operational controls that minimize corporate risk and improve business outcomes. So in this context, we review a manager's written policies, processes, practices, and reporting standards. Equally, we want to understand the manager's sources of capital. Typically, most of the capital that a fund manager has at its disposal comes from third-party investors, also known as limited partners or LPs. So ensuring that the fund manager has done proper due diligence on these investors is very important, not only from a funding perspective to ensure that the money is available when needed when they call the capital, but equally from a reputational perspective. Our understanding is that fund managers typically have comprehensive policies to address these risks, including minimum standards of ongoing financial disclosure.
Great, thank you. So with that being said, it's my understanding that operational risks in a fund can involve a wide range of issues that may impact its functioning. When these operational risks are not managed through strong governance and operational controls, exposure to these risks is increased. Can you highlight some of the major operational risks that exist prominently within the fund sector that you're seeing more of today?
Sure. As issuers continue to become more reliant on technology as part of the investment decision-making and management process, controls related to cybersecurity and information management are critical. Fund managers often have access to proprietary non-public information, which must be closely guarded. And more importantly, they are regularly managing significant amounts of cash. So both money they may have borrowed from lenders, but also money from third-party capital that needs to be directed appropriately. Most fund managers have scaled cash management and operations teams to handle of this cash management process. And some smaller fund managers outsource these responsibilities to capable third parties. We also understand that these managers generally have documented policies in place that require varying levels of approval based on the amount of cash being moved, for example, tiered sign-offs. And essentially, an asset manager's job is to protect and grow the capital that an investor entrusts them with. So this process is equally important alongside their ability to find quality investments.
Following up from my last question, I wanted to ask you about one specific risk that usually leads to more high-profile outcomes of poorly managed governance and operational controls, that risk being fraud. So I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with news stories of asset managers that, for example, forge documents, mislead investors, alter risk reports, etc., that results in them having defrauded a bank or a fund. Can you talk about what kinds of controls failed or are not properly managed to allow for such things to occur?
Yes, I'm happy to at a high level. To be clear, these types of events are extremely rare based on our knowledge of the market. However, on occasion, there have been instances of LPs and fund managers themselves falsifying reporting to suggest that they have a greater amount of financial resources or greater AUM compared to what they actually have. So this has led to both investors and lenders facing the potential of financial loss. But I would say the common threads across these incidents are clear. So one would be insufficient diligence on the part of the fund manager or lender involved. Two, fraudulent reporting without proper third-party auditing or diligence. And the last one would be weaknesses in control framework. So when we at KBRA conduct due diligence, we focus on these points, but not from the perspective of being experts, but rather wanting to hear from the experts in-house at that fund manager to ensure that these types of risks are sufficiently mitigated.
Great. And that leads nicely into my final question. being what is KBRA's due diligence process in our own credit ratings to uncover these kinds of risks?
So, typical governance analysis includes a manager's business model, ownership structure, management profile, as well as strategy and internal policies. All of this can be important factors to consider in the ratings process. We may also look to an issuer's risk management procedures, financial flexibility, and its accountability and transparency. Poor governance can damage an issuer's reputation, which can result in fines and lawsuits, and it can also increase regulation and debt repayment risk, which may be reflected in KBRA's analysis. Additionally, KBRA is interested in how the fund managers or asset managers are preparing for incoming ESG regulations. We may seek to understand the asset manager's oversight of ESG issues and how managers consider possible ESG risks and opportunities in their potential investments. For example, are there any sectors or products that the managers avoid investing in? Are there screens relating to ESG factors applied to the fund strategy? Do they measure and monitor material ESG KPIs for their investments? So we think about all of these factors during our due diligence process.
Thanks, Andrea, for that insight and for speaking with me today and providing our listeners with your sector knowledge of this continually relevant ESG issue.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter.